All right, guys, how you doing? It's Coach Bronson here, and this video is going to knock your socks off. If you're following my channel at all, you know that a couple weeks ago I did an interview with Dr. Robert Sivas. We talked about protein metabolism, we talked about insulin, we talked about things about GLP, energy utilization management for physical activity. We talked about a bunch of different things, and he put some ideas and concepts forward in that video that kind of made you question and rethink a lot of the things that we know or thought we knew about a lot of different aspects of exercise, nutrition, metabolism, things like that. So that kind of got me going into a rabbit hole of research and trying to learn more about some of these topics that we had there: long-term ketosis, how to manage the proper way to do keto, the proper way to do carnivore, because we find out actually a right and a wrong way to do that when it comes to protein and fat macros and a bunch of different things that you guys hear me talk about all the time. So in the context of all those discussions, I got Professor Bart Kay on. We sat down in this video and we talk about the details. We break it down into questions and answers about, is long-term ketosis bad? Can being ketogenic for a long period of time be good, be bad? How is it good? How is it bad? How do you prevent it if you need to? Do you need carbs to cycle in and out on a ketogenic diet for activity, for exercise? There's a bunch of different things that we talk about in here. I highly recommend you get your paper out, just like the other one. Get your paper out, get a pen, something to write with, and take notes, because this one is going to fill in all the gaps. If you had questions after the Dr. Robert Sivas video, this one's going to answer all those questions and maybe even a little bit more. All right, let's hop in. I think you're really going to like this one. All right, everybody. I just want to welcome Professor Bart Kay. Bart, you have been in this space for a long time, doing a lot of good stuff, correcting a lot of information. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to get you on here today, because we have a lot of information that's been coming out that's confusing to me, and I know it's confusing to other people. So before we get into all of that stuff, if you could give us a little background, what are you doing? Why are you doing it? Where do you come from? All that good stuff.
Right. Yes. First of all, thank you once again, Bronson, for having me. It's always a pleasure to cross-pollinate and to share ideas, and, as you say, to correct the either errors or indeed more evil folks, even who aren't making errors, who are actually lying to us,
right.
With malice of forethought, because there is a lot of that going on as well. Today, I suspect I'll be correcting one or two genuine errors made by someone who is not one of these evil people with malice of forethought. This is we're going to be talking about a bloke who is, well educated and has expressed a few ideas which I don't share largely, but we'll get to that.
Sure.
Where do I come from? Okay, I come from a background of 25 years or so in academia as a senior lecturer, professor of health science, and researcher in my own right as well. I started out actually first and foremost as an exercise physiologist. So I studied the physiology of rest and exercise. Mm-hmm. From there, I branched into human nutrition. And then finally, for the last part of my career, I became a specialized cardiovascular pathophysiologist, okay, which is a flash terminology for what causes heart disease, what doesn't. So the heart, the blood vessels, the blood, all of that kind of stuff. Overarching all of that, I also have some advanced qualifications in statistics, statistical inference, pure and applied mathematics of scientific inference, research design, ethics, that kind of stuff. So that's kind of the overall package of where I'm coming from. It's kind of an overview position from 3 or 4 different areas of expertise.
Just a little bit of experience.
Just some. And my big thing is making sure that the information that we're being given by others is above reproach. Mm-hmm. And if it's not above reproach, I reproach it. basically. Yeah.
Yeah, here's a question that just popped into my head, because I know I get this all the time, and I try to help people understand with my limited experience that there's use in all information, but then there's also the context of where that information is coming from, what the purpose of there's a whole bunch of different layers to information, how we use it. But what is the difference, if you could explain the difference between, because I think this may play into the conversation as well, between clinical data and scientific research?
Right. So clinical data is a case study or a series of case studies that either individually or collectively point the clinician in a certain direction and give the clinician an idea about the etiology, means, underpinning cause of a disease process, be that what it may be. And it's that kind of data that usually underpins clinical practice guidelines for physicians, for example. That differs from scientific inference in that what a scientist does is they set up a set of conditions which they control very, very tightly. Our subjects are not free living human beings if we're actually doing science. These are people, if we're dealing with people, then the people that we're dealing with need to be a certain type of people. They need to be randomized in a certain way. They need to come into the lab so that we can keep them under control and observation. And we need to control absolutely every aspect that could conceivably possibly confound our results for the outcome variable we're looking at. And then what we want to do is look at the effect or the relationship between variable X and variable Y with everything else under tight control, so that Z cannot have had an influence on our output Y as that relates to our input X, shall we say.
Okay.
So it's about control, manipulation. It's an experimental protocol in science. Unfortunately, there's been a huge amount of bleed over in the so-called scientific literature, because study after study after study in human physiology, human nutrition, etc., is a mix between pure scientific experimental protocol and clinical observation data set. Papers all sit somewhere in there. Reason being is that it's almost impossible to do an actual experimental, properly controlled piece of work with something as complex as a human being, let alone a whole bunch of human beings.
Right.
And so, unfortunately, it's the clinical, what I call naturalistic observations, really, that tend to inform. And as such, that leaves us open to making errors in how we interpret things, and ergo how we interact, how we treat, how we intervene, both in training methodologies and in the medical field, for example.
Okay. All right, good. I think that sets a good base for kind of where we're going to go from here. And basically, for everybody listening, by the time this video comes out, there will be have been another video that's out on my channel that I did an interview with Dr. Cybus. But then there's also been other interviews, and this is a common theme that I'm seeing pop up from several big names in the keto carnivore space. There's this whole idea of keto flexing. You need carbs if you're dealing with menopause. You need carbs if you're a woman and you're fasting. You need like all of these things, where the message, and this is what drives me crazy, is the message is carbs are not essential. You need to reduce your carbs to become metabolically healthy. But if you do that too long, then you need carbs to fix yourself at the end. And it's like, this isn't making sense to me. And I know there are many people who have a problem with carbs, people that are trying to fix their relationship with food. Carbs are not part of that equation. And they're doing things that, if you're telling them you need to stop eating carbs or reduce your carb intake to get healthy, but then you also telling them, but at the same time, let's complicate it a little bit more by saying sometimes you may need carbs if you're doing this, that, or this or that. And now people are just like, I don't even know what the hell to do, because how am I supposed to cut them out? But then also I need them. And so there's a question of, that logic flow doesn't work for me. There's something missing in that discussion. So
Yeah.
my question is it either one, is there a problem with being ketogenic long-term? Number one. Number two, if there is or isn't, is there a wrong way to be keto or ketogenic carnivore or whatever, where that does mess you up and there are things that you can do improperly? And then three, is it just a matter, there's nothing wrong with either of those first two, and it's just a matter of we're looking at numbers to determine health that have no application to somebody who's ketogenic in their lifestyle.
Yep.
So that's kind of where I want to go with this, and kind of break this down and say, okay, what the hell is going on?
Yeah, right. Okay, so the idea that there are any human beings to speak of who require any amount of carbohydrates, exogenous carbohydrates in their diet, is false. Now, my lifelong friend and colleague, Lord Edward Yellow Ted, would probably phrase it slightly differently. If you're happy with him articulating it himself, Bronson, he can actually do that.
Sure.
If not, we can skip that.
We could, hey, whatever, man. Make the people happy. I know people love Ted.
I'm sure the people do love Ted for whatever reason. But when you say, we require any amount of carbohydrates, basically, here's what Ted would tell you.
Bollocks. There it is.
There you go. Yeah, it's false. It's absolutely false. Anytime anybody says to you, but we need carbs for, that is a correct statement, but it doesn't impact the requirement for exogenous carbohydrate in the diet. Because, let's all say it together, gluconeogenesis. Gluconeogenesis takes care of the provision of the exact amount of carbohydrate required pretty much at all times in the vast majority of human beings. The only time that goes off to any degree is in a state of very, very serious pathology. So for a general audience, for people wondering about their general health, whether you be an athlete or sedentary, so long as you don't have any very, very serious pathologies, gluconeogenesis is going to take care of your need to provide your body with the glucose it requires for all processes requiring that glucose.
Okay.
It's under the control of your hormones, your endocrine system. There are vastly complex interactive pathways that take care of all of this. But at the end of the day, that's what it is.
Okay. And that's happening. And gluconeogenesis is happening all the time. So what about this idea that
to some degree?
Okay. What about this idea that you can have, that there's a threshold of protein intake that if you max out what your liver can handle, then it's just going to be converted into glucose.
Yeah, so that's correct. If your consumption of protein is vastly above your requirement to provide amino acids to your body has to do something with those amino acids. And it has two pathways, really. One, those amino acids that are excess can be deaminated and thus go through various cycles in the body, leading to the production of glucose, one of which is gluconeogenesis, leading to the requirement to excrete extra nitrogen in the form of urea, leading to an effect on the bun ratio, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. Fine. The other thing that can happen in a very, very extreme case is that the excess proteins can be deaminated and it can all just be urinated out.
Okay.
But that only happens in very, very extreme circumstances.
Okay. So we can maybe get into this later, but let's just say the amount of protein that it would take for that to happen is probably more than what most people need to be worried about, right?
Exactly. Yes. I mean, there are people running around saying, protein is bad, okay, and protein will kill you 3 weeks before last Tuesday. You've got absolute clowns, frankly, like Garth, our friend Garth, who's written a whole book about how protein will kill you, ridiculous, suggesting that people have an intake that's vastly lower than what would be indicated and useful and sensible either for sedentary or athletic folks, because let's face it, the numbers are slightly different.
Right.
There is a kind of level of protein intake that is indicated. I generally start out at a given level for a member of the public, a reasonably physically active but not athletic person, shall we say. And I usually work on 1.75 to 2 grams of protein intake per kilogram of lean body mass.
Okay. Yeah, so that's about where I'm at. Yeah, I do 1 gram per pound of lean mass. So it's pretty close.
About the same. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. That seems to be a number that's about right for the vast majority of people. There are some individual differences. We do need to dial in N equals 1 with a bit of experimentation sometimes. And if you are highly physically active, your turnover of protein will be increased, but not twice over.
Exactly.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah,
if you do that,
yeah, there definitely is. I think I saw a study, at least an article reviewing a study. I don't remember which one it was, where they're saying that the diminishing returns is somewhere around 1.5 grams per pound of lean mass. Somewhere that's kind of where it's like anything above 1.5, you're kind of like, what's the point? Like, at this point, like you're not going to gain weight. It's not going to affect you negatively per se, but as far as your ability to build muscle and everything else, is really not helping anything over that.
Yes. So, I mean, one of the things that you and Rob were talking about the other day in the earlier video that you did with him, is he was talking about there being an upper limit to the amount of protein that you can absorb in a sitting, which he's quite right about. And he gave some pretty reasonable numbers for that. He then went on to suggest that doubling that amount in 2 sittings would mean that you are able to absorb so much more protein and use so much more protein, which is technically correct. However, if your body's requirement for amino acids has been subserved by the first bolus, then what's going to happen to the second bolus anyway? You don't, I mean, he was talking about up to 300 grams of protein, I believe.
Was he saying, okay, see, I understood what he was saying as if you take that 150 and you split it up into 2, but he was, that's how I understood it.
All right. In which case that would be far more reasonable if that's what he's, but I've only listened to it once just quickly.
Okay. Yeah.
And it sounded to me like he was suggesting that if you can only absorb 150 at once, and that's, an average value. Some people will be more and some will be less. It depends very much on age, stage, gender, physical size, activity level, time of year, even those kind of things. Sure.
So there's definitely a question of what, if you can only absorb 150, let's use that example. And if your body only needs 150, then however you get that, if you do that in 2 meals of 75, then you're great. But doing 150 or 100 and then 100 even is still going to be 50 more than you need.
All right.
So,
either way, Bronson, I would disagree with Rob.
Okay.
Whichever one he actually did say, they're both not necessarily optimal. And here's why. You do absolutely require some insulin bumping during the day in order to prevent your kidneys from becoming leaky and losing all your electrolytes.
Okay.
If you split your protein bolus into 2 meals, both of which are below a threshold that would give you such a meaningful bump, hello leaky kidneys, hello loss of electrolytes, hello electrolyte problems.
Okay, let's track that down a little bit. So that goes into the bigger question we talked about at the very beginning, where this idea of being in ketosis or being ketogenic long-term is a problem because your insulin's low, you're not stimulating your T3 and all these other issues. I've always looked at protein as being the solution for that. If you're getting enough protein, you're just going to have that insulin response, and it's going to kick you out of ketosis. Now, from what I'm getting from several places, and now from Dr. Cybus in that interview, he's talking about there's in his clinical data, he's seeing thousands of people who are eating high amounts of protein and they're no longer have an insulin response to the protein. So where's that coming from? And is that a thing? Like what could cause that? How does that happen?
That's the inverse problem. Okay. So the thing with protein is it's like anything else. There is an inverted N, if you like. There is an optimal, correct, if you like, amount of protein you should be taking in. Too little, which is what I was talking about with splitting it into two aliquots, or having one aliquot that's insufficient, both will lead to the same problem. Lack of insulinogenic response, leaky kidneys, lack of thyroid, all the things you're talking about there. Too much protein, blunting of the insulin response, excess gluconeogenesis, because it then becomes supply driven over and above demand driven, and it becomes problematic.
Okay. So
these
people that are
the correct amount of protein.
Right. So these people that are doing 300 grams of protein a day,
too much.
It's like, why are you doing that? Right. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly.
Because I have clients that recently I've been going through the numbers and I'm looking, I'm like, why are you eating 300 grams of protein a day? It's like, well, because I'm hungry. I'm like, that's because you're eating 300 grams of protein a day. You're not as satiated. You feel like you need to eat more. So drop your protein.
All right. Well, here's another rule of thumb. Here's another rule of thumb for you. If you are a highly active athlete, or indeed someone who's attempting to maximize muscle hypertrophy,
that's me.
The upper limit, the maximum amount of protein you should consider putting into your body is 1 gram per centimeter of height per day.
That's a new one. Okay.
So if you want to eat 300 grams of protein, you better be 3 meters tall. Otherwise, you're eating too much protein.
Okay. I have not heard that one before. I'll have to play around with that.
With one exception, and I did make this exception on my video that I'm going to premiere on my channel tomorrow morning, where Jeff Nippard is talking about how to get ripped.
Okay.
Now, 1 gram of protein per centimeter of height for Jeff Nippard is not going to be enough, is it? Oh dear. Sorry, Jeff. Love you, son.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So there's a little context that has to get laid into that one.
Exactly. So,
okay.
If you're short or if you're achondroplasic or something like that, then obviously that's not going to work.
Yeah. Now, could you say as well, like, so for me, right, I have 185 pounds. I'm specifically trying to build and grow muscle right now. And I'm at about 1.2 grams per pound of lean mass. And it's been working great for me. I maybe go up to 1, 2.5, 1, 3, but for the most part, that's where I'm at. So, anybody that's doing 1.5 or higher for your protein, you're probably way more than you need to be. And then that's where you can see this problem, right? Especially if, now, how does that tie in with people that are doing this and then they're also keeping their fat low? That makes it worse.
So the avoidance of fat is a mistake. You absolutely must consume fat and protein in your diet. Again, there's an ideal range and there's a standard deviation around it, and there's individual variation, and it depends on a lot of things. But for the middle of the road, average Joe Blow off the street, I'm going to start 66-33.
Okay.
Which is 1-to-1 by mass of protein and fat, which on a plate of meat is 7/8 meat and 1/8 fat.
Right.
So they're all the conversions that you can make. So you can just look at your plate. Does that look like it's about 1/8 fat and 7/8 meat? Jobs are good on.
See, Bart, this is why I know I like you, because we've never talked about this stuff, but we do the same thing. So I like it. All right, good. Cool. That makes me feel good. That makes me feel good. The professor and I are doing the same thing. I feel good about myself right now.
Awesome. And the check to make sure that you're not overdoing it on your protein, really, if there's any one check, and one thing is never a whole story, but this is a fairly robust thing in general. All you really need to do is look at your bun creatine ratio.
Okay.
Assuming that you don't have any of these other pathologies that can cause that ratio to go off, assuming you're otherwise healthy, if your bun creatinine ratio goes off, it would suggest that your protein intake is probably too high. That is
Okay.
if your blood urea nitrogen is high with respect to your creatinine, too much protein.
Right.
If your ratio is the other way around, insufficient protein.
Okay, so here, this is good. So if someone like me is specifically trying to build lean mass, and I know that at 1-to-1, 1 gram of protein to 1 pound of lean mass, I don't gain. I can maintain, no problem, but I don't gain. If I go to 1.2, I can gain, but after a couple months of that, my bun starts going crazy. Right. Then that's just something I have to play around with and say, you know, hey, what am I trying to do? What's that balance? What's the effect of my life? All that other kind of stuff, right?
So you may need to engage in a bit of cyclic alteration to your diet over periods of time, so that across nominally a year, your ratio may, but it doesn't
continue to go up. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because, you know, at the end of the day, hypertrophy training, building muscle mass, is not a thing the human body naturally does above a certain ratio.
Right.
This is an unnatural activity. It's based around a specific goal that is not in line with our genetic programming. So as such, you're going to have to think about some of these things and keeping some of these things in check.
Okay.
And that's why training is cyclic. That's why your diet can be cyclic. And that also does close the loop on this whole idea: is ketogenesis, ketogenic diets, are they dangerous long term? Can they be problematic long term? Yes, they can. If you think about the ketogenic diet in the wrong way, and if you plan and execute it in the wrong way, if you do it wrong.
Okay, so yep.
The goal of a ketogenic diet is absolutely not to produce ketones all the time, to have ketones all the time. You're measuring your ketones is a have, is an expensive have. You don't need to measure your ketones ever.
Boom.
Because the goal of a ketogenic diet is in optimizing your metabolic health, optimizing your body composition, and your energetics. It has nothing whatever to do with there being excess ketones in your blood at any given time at all. And if you are the sort of person who thinks the goal is to be in ketogenesis all the time and to absolutely avoid anything that could possibly kick you out of ketosis, and to thus write questions on all the social media, will this kick me out? Will that kick me out? Will the other thing kick me out? My friend, you need to go back to school, okay? Because one decent bolus of protein, that 150 grams, for example, once a day, will kick you out because of the protein content.
Right. But like you said, that's what we want.
Interaction of that protein with the fat that comes with it.
Right. And like you said, though, that's what we want. We're looking for that to happen.
Absolutely. It must happen. If it does not happen, if you remain in ketosis to above a certain threshold at all times, precisely because you're avoiding protein in order to prevent that from happening, number one, you're going to be deficient in protein, and that's going to cause a bunch of problems. And number two, that is going to affect your thyroid function. That's going to affect your hormonal endocrine functioning, including your so-called insulin sensitivity. It's going to screw things up for you. Purely because you've got the wrong idea in your head about what the goal of this dietary approach is.
So when we talk about the scenarios of somebody who's been ketogenic long-term, most likely avoiding protein, trying to stay in ketosis, which is the wrong way. Somebody who is, let's talk about women who are dealing with menopause. Let's talk about women who are trying to do intermittent fasting. Let's talk about all of these other scenarios that a lot of people, big influencers in the space now, are saying that we need to flex in and out and be metabolically flexible by the food that we eat, not how our body processes internal function, which I think are two different things. Let's say all of that stuff is right. We need insulin because this is what they're all blaming it on. It's all insulinogenic. If somebody has been overeating protein and they're not getting that insulin response, is there a process? Is it just a matter of cutting it back down some and seeing what happens? Like, how do you know if you're getting an insulin response from the protein that you're eating? if you're not measuring ketones?
Right. Okay. So if your protein intake is way too high, you would think, well, that wouldn't be an issue on the insulin side of things, because the area under the insulin curve would be taken care of by the gluconeogenesis that would be the result of the too much amino acids.
I was going to ask that question next.
Right. However, there are several things that play into that. Number one, the insulinogenic response to amino acids is vastly lower than what you will get from sugar.
Mm-hmm.
And there's an intermediate response that you'll get from a mixture of protein with fat.
Okay. And is that where GLP-1 comes into play?
That's exactly where GLP-1 comes in, yes.
Okay, can we talk about that a little bit? Is that the mechanism? Is that what we're talking about here when we're talking about the insulin response from protein? And just for anybody, what I'm getting to with this, guys, is if you've been listening to influencers who are telling you that you need carbs to maintain keto long term, and what we're talking about here is you don't have to do it with carbs. Protein can do it for you. That's essentially what we're saying. So this is, and we're going to, and Professor Bart's going to get into how that works. Yeah.
However, this only works effectively if you keep your fat intake appropriate as well.
Boom.
Protein by itself is vastly attenuated. It has a very, very small insulinogenic action. You have to mix the fat with the protein to bring that level up to the level that will maintain your kidney function, your thyroid function, all of those things in the natural range. When you think about it, as we evolved as obligate hypercarnivore predators on the plains, we would take down an animal, a large animal, maybe once a week. We would gorge on that. We would feed up on that. There'd be a bolus of fat and protein that would all take into satiety over the next several days. Mm-hmm. And then as that ran out, we would then be running on our reserves for a few days, at least, sometimes up to a week before we would make another kill. But make no mistake, we were into it with the protein and the fat together. We didn't pick out the muscle meat, cut the fat off the side of it.
Right.
You know, and also if we were drinking milk, we weren't first separating out the fat and skimming most of it off.
Yep. Pasteurizing it, cooking it, and all that other stuff.
Yeah, and all of those kind of things. We weren't doing any of those things. That wasn't the natural design at all.
Yeah.
So if you are taking in a huge amount of amino acid or protein without the correct ratio of fat with it, you will not achieve the correct responses hormonally, endocrine system wise, all of that.
Okay.
You will not get the appropriate insulin response.
Yeah.
There will be a blunting of everything. There will be a toning down of your everything, really.
Okay. So when we talk about the stuff we said at the beginning, is there a problem with being ketogenic long term? Is it people doing things wrong? Those first two things are both a yes. There's a potential yes in both of those.
Yeah, if you do it wrong.
There is a problem, and you can do it wrong.
Yes, absolutely. So first of all, you need to understand that the goal of the ketogenic diet is not to have ketones, to be in ketosis, and to avoid being kicked out at all costs.
Right.
They're all mistakes. You do want to be kicked out of ketosis once a day, every day on days that you're eating. Maybe you're doing alternate day fasting for whatever reason, fine. If you are eating that day, you want to eat your food in one sitting. So that's one point where I'm going to diverge from Rob and say, no, Rob, I'm sorry, son. No, you do not want to split your food into several intakes in a day under any circumstances. Okay. You want to eat your meal, your one meal a day, and that needs to be based on the appropriate amount of protein and an amount of fat commensurate with that amount of protein. And what you're going to find is that energetically, that's going to be a bolus of food in one sitting, which will serve your energetic requirement for the day pretty much.
Okay, interesting. So I usually do two, but I eat a lot of food in both of those. So
Right.
So,
okay, so
I don't know if I could do all the food that I eat in a day in one meal.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, what I just said is correct for your averagely active person. If you are undertaking high intensity training if you are extremely active,
Yeah.
then maybe you do need to eat twice, but you don't need to eat twice as much as you would have eaten in one meal.
Right. Gotcha. Yeah,
There's
it's a daily requirement. It's not a here's how much you need at every meal regardless.
Right. So I would still suggest one main meal, one large meal that would subserve the normal person's requirement, because you do need that bolus of protein with fat in one big hit at one sitting to produce that insulin response.
Right.
And then if you need a small amount of additional food because of the very high level of physical activity, then add a second, much smaller meal.
Gotcha. This is awesome stuff, Bart. I appreciate it. This is starting to bring a lot of things in together, because there's been a lot of questions about this stuff for me. And the one thing that I find interesting is all of the people that are saying you need these carbs to flex in and out and do this cycling and everything else. Yep. I can never get actual answers as to why from most of them.
Okay.
And I'm trying to like, where's the data coming from? What is this all about? I don't understand. I thought protein could do this. And this is the clearest conversation I've been able to have with anybody about this topic. So thank you very much. I know I appreciate it. And I'm sure a bunch of other people do too.
My pleasure. So the exact dietary requirement for carbohydrates in human beings, all human beings, is not 1 gram ever. With one exception, really, I suppose. Type 1 diabetics who are taking insulin and must counteract that or they will die.
Gotcha. So that's a balancing of that insulin that they're taking. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's not because those people require carbohydrates. It's because if they don't balance the insulin, the exogenous unnatural amount of insulin they're whacking in one bolus,
right,
they will die.
Okay.
And no amount of protein and fat taken in will actually counteract that, because most pharmacological interventions of the insulin type are designed to work with carbohydrates.
Right.
So
if we're okay, so let's get back to the fat and the protein thing. We were talking about GLP-1. That's where GLP-1 comes into play. So could you explain what GLP-1, and I'm guessing GIP as well. I don't know if you need to get in GIP at all, or if we could just keep it on GLP. I don't want to confuse people too much.
We can probably keep it generally quite simple. GLP-1 is the glucagon-like peptide number 1, for those that want to know. It's a type of sort of hormone-like messenger, if you like. And it has several different effects on several different tissues, which lead us to believe nowadays that it may well be more of a linchpin even than insulin is in terms of our responses, our balance of everything. And in fact, now they're starting to use GLP-1 agonists,
right, to control
potential
satiety and a bunch of other things.
Yeah, exactly. So when GLP is released, it sends a signal to the hypothalamus, which is one of the major glands that controls the level of just about everything else. And it controls our appetite and thirst and a few of those other very basic responses. For that reason, it's very, very important, if you are on a GLP-1 agonist, that you do consume a certain amount and check that you are consuming a certain amount of fluids, because your thirst will be toned down to the point where you can become dehydrated and it becomes very, very dangerous.
Okay.
One of the side effects of that drug that needs to be taken care of. The other thing it does is that when you've got GLP-1, it turns down your desire for food. So obviously they're using it in diabetics who have aberrant control of that. Right. As one of the modes of action of this
control eating behavior.
Yeah. And at the level of muscles, GLP-1 stimulates gluconeogenesis. It upregulates it.
Okay.
And that means that the muscle tissues themselves will be making new glucose out of amino acids, for example, or glycerol backbones from triglyceride molecules, fat molecules, or indeed monocarboxylates such as, for example, lactate directly. Okay. And it will also lower the blood sugar by stimulating glucose uptake at the muscle cell as well for things like muscle glycogen synthesis.
Okay.
So it's building its own glucose and it's drawing more glucose in. It's a message to the muscle cell that there is plenty of energy to be had and you should have at it. You should fill your boots.
Okay.
So
And is that in insulin, is that where the insulin spike comes from, or the insulin response comes from? GLP-1?
Well, if you've got gluconeogenesis occurring, this is what's really interesting. If you've got gluconeogenesis occurring, and if you've got blood glucose being drawn down by muscle cells, then how would that stimulate insulin? It would seem to have the opposite effect logically,
right?
Wouldn't it? So that's an interesting finding there. However, the offset is this: the so-called insulin sensitivity goes vastly up. So it's not about the amount of insulin that's available, it's about the sensitivity to it. Now, here's another point of divergence between myself and Rob, and indeed a number of other commentators. Rob's not the only one. There are people running around all over the place talking about insulin resistance, insulin sensitivity. Rob even said, this is something that we measure in my practice every day. No, Rob, you do no such thing. No. Insulin sensitivity / insulin resistance, they are conjugate pair. They are both constructs. They are a concept. They're an idea. Please tell me what manufacturer makes an insulin resistance meter and sells that to clinicians.
Right. Yeah, I've never.
It does not exist.
Yeah.
What are they measuring? They are measuring blood glucose, the area under a blood glucose curve, and they're also measuring the area under an insulin curve as a function of time under whatever stimulus. A bolus of carbohydrate, a bolus of protein.
It's an equation based on a
exactly.
time set.
It's a construct.
Yeah.
Right. The thing that's actually being measured is not insulin resistance or insulin sensitivity. It's blood glucose response and it's insulin response. Here's the problem. That curve, whether it be the glucose curve or the insulin curve, doesn't matter. Whatever your concentration of glucose or insulin in your blood is at any given time depends on two things: the input of insulin, its production, and the removal of insulin, its utilization. From the blood. There are 4 different control levers to the insulin resistance.
Okay.
It says my internet connection is unstable, so if I disappear, I do.
No, that's good. You froze for like 2 seconds. So you were saying we got you just at the insulin. You would just go back like a minute in what you're talking about.
So 4 control levers.
Yep.
Input, drawdown.
Yep.
For glucose, input and drawdown for insulin.
For insulin, right.
Okay. 4 different ways that can affect the area under both those curves, ergo the one output to that, insulin resistance.
Okay.
Absolute nonsense.
Yeah. So I'll just give a corollary that people may be able to connect to a little bit more. And that's what we talk about when we talk about nutrient intake versus bioavailability.
Yep.
How much do you eat that your body actually gets to use? And we know that that's different in plants versus meat and all those other kind of things. So we're talking, that's kind of what we're talking about. So your body can make a bunch of insulin. It's not if it's making a bunch, it's are you using a bunch or not using a bunch? Right. Same with the blood sugar. Okay.
So at the muscle, GLP-1 causes the muscle to draw down more glucose from the blood and create more of its own as well.
Okay.
The sensitivity to insulin is increased.
Right.
On top of that, when GLP-1 is encountered by the pancreas releases more insulin. So there actually is an increase.
Okay.
So there's both an increase in insulin production and an increase in drawdown of glucose, thus an increase in insulin sensitivity.
Right.
A concept. That's how it happens. But that's the mechanism, by the way.
Okay.
And also GLP-1 causes the pancreas to decrease its production of glucagon, which is basically inverse insulin. So that makes perfect sense.
So it's not going to make as much. So it's not, the pancreas won't produce, the pancreas isn't going to kick off more glucagon, which is going to keep your blood sugar down. But if you're getting protein, gluconeogenesis may help that go up, but your insulin sensitivity is increasing while you're, that makes sense.
Right. Now
there's all these moving parts that all kind of go.
Exactly. And it's like, you need to understand all of this. Okay.
Yeah.
Now also that situation leads us to a point where we now need to control the level of blood glucose so it doesn't get too high. Mm-hmm. And how is that done? Well, when GLP-1 is experienced by the liver, then the hepatic output of glucose drops. Right. Okay. And that helps to maintain or indeed lead to a slight lowering even of the actual blood concentration.
Which is, okay, so if we're getting a proper bolus of protein and fat, it's the combination, is it mostly the protein, is it the fat? What is triggering GLP-1 to make all of this stuff happen?
It's thought to be the fat.
It's thought to be the fat. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's why the fat is so vital. And that's why when you reduce or indeed avoid fat and rely on a heavily protein-based diet, that's where the problem is.
Now, is that okay? So, because my understanding, and this is just my little bit of research that I've done on GLP-1 in the last 2 weeks, is that there's an initial GLP-1 response in the stomach from fat and bile, and then in the lower intestine for protein.
Yes. So, and that's the much smaller, much more delayed. It has a lower peak and a longer duration as well.
Okay.
But you've got this in the stomach, bam.
Right.
And much later, more like that.
Gotcha. Okay. But if you just get one all the time and not the other, or not one, if it's not balanced on both, then you're not getting the full benefit of GLP-1. Okay.
That's right. Then you're out of whack.
Interesting.
Then your insulin sensitivity chronically is going to be upset. Mm-hmm. Your blood glucose homeostasis may well lose control, and your blood glucose, your A1C, are going to drift up over time.
Mm-hmm. So go ahead.
Basically, when people come to me and say, "Oh, I've been carnivore for 2 years now, and suddenly my A1C is off whack, and my resting blood glucose is off whack," and
you read my mind.
What's going on? That's what's going on.
Too much protein, not enough
too much
fat.
Protein, not enough fat.
Yep. Interesting. Which is funny because right now it's like a warring tribes. There's the high protein group, and then there's the high fat group. And I've been in the middle for the last several months trying to tell people, like, you need both, people. It's not one or the other. I prefer, and you can tell me if this makes sense, I'm trying to get people to break from ratios and percentages. Yeah, and get away. Like I keep telling people, it's not a sliding scale with protein on one end and fat on the other. It's two individual knobs, and you need to adjust the two to what's the best combination that's going to work for you.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. We need to talk more often, man.
One of the easiest ways that you can track all of this without too much technical intervention is to think about how you feel. How are your energy levels? How's your performance in the gym if you're doing that kind of thing, or in the sport that you're undertaking, whatever?
Yep.
How's your mood? And if you are taking, one or two bloods here and there on a reasonably sort of semi-regular basis, you might just have a look at your creatinine bun ratio. You might have a look at your liver function test. Mm-hmm. You might look at your glomerular filtration rate, your GFR. I can never pronounce that one. They're the ones you want to keep an eye on, and also, obviously your resting blood glucose and your A1C.
Okay, and we can't call those numbers, air quotes, inapplicable for someone who's on a ketogenic diet. They're still applicable regardless of your diet. Yep.
I mean, there have been ideas, people talking about it's about the longevity of your red blood cells. I don't think that's an idea that holds a lot of merit.
Yep.
Sure, there may be some impact there, but still, if that ratio is off, if your A1C is, 5.5 and above, if your resting glucose is over 100 by mid-morning, something's off.
Okay.
Probably.
And most likely it's protein, too much protein.
Not enough fat.
Throughout the day, right? Now, we're not talking about per meal. It's throughout the day.
Well, ideally, it's one meal a day for most people, except for very highly tuned athletes such as yourself, of course, young man.
Trying to get there. Awesome.
Yeah.
This is fantastic, man. I'm going to run through this and take some notes. I was planning on doing my own review of all this stuff and having my own video on is long-term ketogenesis harmful? And I still may do that, but I think you covered pretty much all of the points that I would have covered in that video. So maybe I'll just do a recap of the stuff I've been seeing over the past few months. But thank you very much. Is there anything you want to leave anybody with as far as this goes? Should anybody be scared of being ketogenic long-term?
Okay, great. A great way to really cap it all off, I guess, and close the circle on all of that. I started a ketogenic approach to life about 27 years ago. And my health has never been better. There have been a couple of relatively short periods during that 27 years where I've been off course, where I've been off program for various reasons of stress, distress. I've had some mental health issues during that time as well for various reasons. But mostly I've lived a ketogenic approach to life, as I say, for about 27 years, of which the last 8 have been 90% plus carnivore. And several periods of 100% carnivore as an N equals 1 to see how much better 100% is carnivore than even 95. And the answer is 100% carnivore is 100% better than 95% carnivore in terms of what you get out.
It's amazing.
It's truly amazing. Do you need to worry about long-term ketogenesis? Are there any health risks? No, so long as you are consuming an adequate amount of both protein and fat, and not too much relatively of either of those. One of the great things about volume, because that's a separate knob again, well, how about total energetic intake? How about total diet? The answer to that is if your fat and protein ratio is correct, you will not overeat. You can't. Your body won't allow it. The satiety signals are so powerful that you will not overeat.
That might be my next experiment, is to try to do what I'm doing from a body composition perspective, but without tracking.
Yep.
And see what
the
happens.
thing is, I mean, we've done really well. We've survived really well, really fit, lithe, healthy, apex predators for basically 4.5 million years. And I've never seen a cave painting of warriors holding tablets where they're entering and what they've eaten,
exactly,
tracking their macros and thinking
or with
about
pot bellies,
calories.
right? Or with pot bellies, one of the other.
Or with pot bellies, no, they don't have those either. You're right. Also, you don't see pictures of salads on the wall, do you?
No, not at all. Not at all.
Or potatoes. Sorry, Irish folks.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor. I appreciate it. We'll definitely have you back on. We got to do this more often. I love talking with you. I think
yes, please.
The more time we spend talking, the more I realize we're very similar in the way we do things. So that makes me feel good. So I appreciate it.
Indeed. My pleasure. Thanks.
Where can people find you? I know we got your YouTube channel. You're not on Facebook as much. You got a couple other sites you're doing stuff on.
Yeah, I've got a Facebook presence. I'm there, but I check it, perhaps twice a week if you're lucky. I'm on Instagram, same thing, a couple of times a week if you're lucky. I used to be on Twitter. I've still got an account there, but I'm having a war with Twitter, a standoff. They want me to withdraw a comment I made. Otherwise, they won't give me access to their platform. And I've said, no, I won't be withdrawing it. I meant what I said and I said what I meant. So that's a standoff. So no Twitter. I have the YouTube channel.
Yep.
Fine YouTube
Science.
channel.
Okay.
I've also got about 5 other YouTube channels, which are all linked under all my videos on the primary channel. So you can go and sub to all my YouTube channels if you want. There are slightly different approaches to things on the different channels. One of them is a collar and tie channel, no swearing. One of them is my main channel where there's not so many collars or ties and much more curse words. I've got the Meat Militia, which is more like a comedy channel. That's where Ted lives mostly.
Okay. Okay.
And the Field Marshal, they live there. And a few other channels as well, one of which is about nature in New Zealand and how beautiful that is.
Okay.
And one of them is all singing or playing guitar, no dancing.
No dancing. Okay.
No,
I'm surprised you don't have a cricket channel.
Well, maybe I will. Maybe I'll put a camera on my helmet when I'm playing and say, here's helmet cam. There are folks doing that. I might do that too at some point, whatever. So they're the places you'll find me. The easiest way to get in contact with me is to send me an email.
Okay.
My email address is on the About tab on the front page of my main email channel. Just be aware that I get a ton of emails. So it may be a week or so before I get back to you, depending. If it's really urgent, mark it urgent, and it better be, because otherwise I'll send Ted round, and you don't want that.
Yep. Fantastic.
Right, that's me.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks.